Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Miriam. I'm part of the science team at Climatic. And today I'm here with my colleague Anastasia. And it's our pleasure to have Professor Shelie Miller with us, with whom we would like to talk about life cycle assessment, greenhouse gas emissions accounting, and also food sustainability. Anastasia?
Great, yes. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here with Mariam and with Professor Miller. Welcome.
Professor Miller is the Director of Program in the Environment at School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. Dr. Miller's research uses life cycle assessment and scenario modeling to identify environmental problems before they occur. She's particularly interested in the human technology interface and how technology enables changes in consumption. By proactively understanding the environmental issues of emerging technologies, her work identifies a greater number of options and more creative solutions to avoid or reduce negative consequences. Dr. Miller's research group works on a variety of topics, including the energy water nexus, bioenergy, refrigeration in the food system, and autonomous vehicles. Shelley, would you like to add anything here?
I think you've covered it. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Great. So we have prepared some questions for Shelley, but please ask your questions in the chat box and we will find some time to address those at the end. So I'll start with my first question. Shelley, can you please, why is it important and also what are the scopes of emissions? And when we're talking about sustainability, for example, food sustainability, how each approach, LCA and scopes of emissions accounting can help us measure and reduce the emissions of the supply chain.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, my work and my research tends to be very much in the life cycle assessment piece. And so often I get asked questions of how is life cycle assessment different from, say, greenhouse gas protocols and greenhouse gas accountings? And my answer tends to be dependent on who I'm talking to. So if I'm talking to someone who's just asking me on the street, I say they're pretty much the same thing. If I'm talking to someone in the industry, they're actually quite different. And so when we're talking about life cycle assessment, it is a full accounting across the entire supply chain of a specific product, and goes well beyond greenhouse gas emissions, or at least it should. And so it's not just thinking about climate emissions, it's also talking about water quality, it's talking about air emissions, it's talking about toxic emissions, hopefully also in a way of understanding where toxic emissions are going and really being mindful of, community burdens of toxics and those kind of things. So it's really a full overall accounting throughout the supply chain. And life cycle assessment doesn't necessarily care who's responsible for which emissions. And I think that's an important piece when we're thinking through the difference between, say, greenhouse gas protocol, carbon accounting versus overall life cycle. Life cycle emissions, it's, sometimes it's the user that's responsible. Sometimes it's a manufacturer who's responsible. Sometimes, and usually, there's multiple different companies and industries throughout the entire supply chain of a product who have some responsibility for the environmental impacts of that product. When we talk about greenhouse gas protocols and greenhouse gas accountings, and we start using words like scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, those are really the emissions that an individual entity is responsible for. And that might be associated to a specific product base, but often it's more about the corporation at large or the entity at large. And so that's really thinking through, all right, as far as greenhouse gas emissions that, the entity has some sort of control over. Can we account for those? Can we actually think about our responsibility throughout the supply chain or the value chain that company is responsible for? And so when we start thinking about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, it's various levels of control over who has control over which emissions. So scope 1 emissions are those emissions that are directly responsible from the company. Scope 2 tends to be the energy that companies purchase to do their operations. And scope 3 tends to be a much broader scope that can take into everything from transportation of their employees back and forth to work to various indirect emissions that their products may have. and so would take into account things like what happens after a product leaves their facility. And so they are very much related in terms of life cycle assessment and carbon accounting, but their purposes tend to be fairly different. Did that actually answer the general question, or this?
And it seems that measuring, of course, yes. And it seems that measuring scope 3 emissions is a challenge, right, for
Well,
businesses?
it's a big challenge, and it goes to what you decide, or what an entity decides is within scope 3 emissions can be very difficult. And this is true of whether we're talking life cycle assessment or whether we're talking about scope 3 greenhouse gas accounting. Figuring out what our actual boundaries are, in terms of what should be in scope and what should be out of scope, can be quite challenging, and is a bit dependent on the company or the product itself, but it is a bigger discussion. It's not quite as straightforward as what's the electricity bill, and then can I put that to a certain amount of grid emissions and then be able to calculate that. There's a lot more conversation that have to go into scope 3 emissions, than you would normally have to with scope 1 or scope 2.
Yeah. And LCA actually can help with the scope 3 emissions account, right? I mean, life cycle inventory and life cycle data can actually
Yes, and
help
I
with.
think that's where you see a lot of the intersection between life cycle assessment and emissions accounting, because life cycle has been around for a lot longer than the greenhouse gas protocol. And so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in terms of where do you draw boundaries, what is in scope, what is out of scope, what are the things that, yes, might be in scope but aren't worthwhile tracking because it's going to be a lot of effort to track, but the actual impact is pretty minimal. And so there's a lot of lessons, I think, from life cycle assessment methods and also the life cycle data, that we've collected over various products and services and technologies over the years that can be used to calculate or estimate scope 3 emissions.
Mhm. And right now, businesses are pushed towards measuring and reporting their supply chain emissions. And what LC activity should they care most about? I mean, which data they need to collect, and is the data easily accessible or not?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that people struggle with a good bit, and it's always a bit frustrating in the life cycle assessment community because individual results vary so much, and so in terms of pieces of the supply chain to really focus on, that really depends on the company itself and what its product is, whether it's a physical product or a virtual type service product. That's going to be very, very different. And, the boundaries of that is going to be different. If you are working for a company that's making a specific thing, then it's kind of a question of, do the emissions fall more on the user side after it leaves your facility, or are most of the emissions associated with the upstream supply chain, either within your facilities or the suppliers that you're purchasing from? In many cases, it's easier to deal with, your suppliers and trying to figure out, do the folks that you're purchasing from, do they actually have the kinds of environmental ethics that fit with your values? And are they trying to also reduce their emissions throughout the supply chain because there's more control that way over sort of upstream supply chain? Consumers are harder to deal with. And so then trying to think through, okay, if most of your product emissions are coming in the use phase, how can you help consumers actually reduce emissions? And so these are any sort of energy consuming technologies, right? And so no, the easiest thing is to focus on the energy efficiency of the product, but also thinking about how to educate users on how to reduce their environmental impacts, whether that is trying to think through, if it's a smart kind of technology, can you actually teach and educate users on how to keep those use phase emissions as small as possible? And so that's a very generic idea, but sort of that's usually what I focus on, is sort of, are they use phase or are they more upstream in the process, and where does that make sense to dedicate most of your efforts?
Mhm. Yep. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I was just thinking, yeah, most of the companies are looking at the scope-free emissions from the upstream, but use phase is often overlooked. And yeah, thank you. It's an interesting perspective.
Yep. And so if you want to focus on a specific sector, for example, food sustainability, and how LCA has been used in such analysis. I know you have done a lot of work on food sustainability, and especially because it's related to the users' consumptions as well, right? And
Yes.
can you please share some of your interesting and surprising results
Sure, yeah,
about
happy
food
to. And I could
sustainability?
spend all day talking about all of the various things that we talk about in the food, LCA, and sustainability space. So we've done, like you say, Miriam, we've done a lot of different studies on food LCA and agricultural LCA, both for bioenergy products as well as actual consumable food and food waste. And so this is one of those things where the agricultural emissions associated with food tend to dominate the life cycle. And so there's two ways of really getting at reducing emissions from food. One is improving the emissions at the agricultural stage, but the other is tackling the use phase and really tackling food waste, because anytime we waste food, we waste all of those upstream emissions. And so both of those kind of have to come together. I think one of sort of, for me, sort of one of the, it wasn't a shocking result, but what was shocking was actually the reception of the LCA study. So we did a study a number of years ago that was looking at prepackaged meal kits. So the meal kits that come to delivered direct to people's doors, they have all of the ingredients to make a meal in them. And so we had some students who looked at the meal kits and then looked at the same meals sourced from a grocery store, brick and mortar grocery store, to see which ones had reduced emissions. And I'll admit the reason we did this study is because I had a number of friends who were feeling very guilty about the amount of packaging associated with the meal kits and the big cardboard boxes and all of the different plastic in them. And they said, there's no possible way meal kits can be better. And sort of from a systems analysis perspective, I was like, well, I'm not entirely sure that's true. Because yes, there's probably more packaging associated with meal kits, but they're pre-proportioned. There's probably not much food waste. The logistics of a meal kit are very streamlined. And you have last mile emissions associated with not going back and forth to and from a grocery store, but a more logistically optimized route of a truck dropping off many packages at once. So we ran the numbers, and the results were what we expected, that the meal kits actually did have lower greenhouse gas emissions and environmental impact overall than the same meal sourced from the grocery store. People hated this study. And the reason they hated this study is because they said there's no possible way we reject your results. And we said, yes, when you actually calculate the emissions from packaging and plastics, yes, those emissions are definitely worse from the meal kit. There just is more packaging associated with the meal kit. But when you actually take into account the food piece, which is by far the more environmentally impactful piece of this box, the meal kit is, definitely better in terms of overall food waste. So what was surprising to me was less the result, but the overall reception and perception of the result, because we have such a focus on packaging, which is rightful. There's a lot of impacts on packaging, but we tend to focus much more on the packaging than what's in the package itself. I think overall as society and consumers, and also sometimes as environmentalists.
Yeah, and this really shows how LCA, I mean, taking into account LCA emissions can really change the interpretations and results.
For sure. And also how you draw your boundary, right? Because if you're just doing a packaging study, if you're just thinking about, okay, well, what's the best way to package this product, you lose the idea of the change in food waste associated with packaging. And so it really does come down to sort of thinking through from a systematic perspective, okay, if we get rid of this plastic, does this actually change the amount of food waste that might happen throughout the supply chain? And so I think that there is sort of that struggle of, all right, how do you always back up and think through in the more systematic framing?
Yeah. Yeah, so here the most intuitive kind of idea can be actually not correct at all.
Yes. And often, and that often tends to be the case, right? Where you think, oh, well, this has to be better because I'm improving this part of environmental impact. But if you're not thinking about the whole piece, you might improve that piece over there, but changing, a much bigger lever somewhere else, which is, of course, the beauty of life cycle assessment, but also the struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. So me and Mariam, we spent quite some time working in academia. So we are very keen on bringing academia and industry a bit closer to work with each other. And I know that you also did a lot of industry-related projects, and of course, LCA is all about industry and products and so on. So yeah, maybe in your experience, what is the most common practices that businesses are using now when they want to measure and report their emissions? So yeah.
No, so it's a great question, and I do think that the greenhouse gas protocol is probably the most widely used in terms of overall framework. I will say, depending on the size of the company and how many people they have to really think about these kinds of things, it really does, run the gamut of folks who really know, okay, we've done this before, we're going to, we have a sustainability report that comes out every year. We know what goes in it. We just have to monitor these kinds of things and meet our goals over time. And there's usually dedicated individuals who do sort of life cycle assessment and carbon accounting. But not all companies have that ability and have, the staffing to be able to do that. And so when you look at sort of smaller companies and more startup companies who often are trying to put out environmentally friendly products on the market, they often struggle to do the kinds of assessments that the larger companies often can do because they have folks in-house to do it. And so it really does run the gamut of, individuals who have dedicated staff who really are trained in LCA, to folks who are just kind of poking around the internet and trying to find, like, how do you actually do this? And so the hope is to be able to serve both. And I think, the tools that your team is trying to develop can certainly help with some of those entities that are trying to dig around data, and there's, it's everywhere. And so trying to actually get a handle on, okay, well, what is the carbon impact of aluminum versus glass versus plastic? And it's not easily accessible in a simple Google search.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And also, like, from your perspective, you mentioned that a lot of companies have kind of in-house teams that are looking at the reporting and so on. And reporting usually happens once per year, so it's always this retrospective look, so to say. And do you think that more businesses want to see also in the future, like to do some projections or scenarios, maybe assess some strategies to reduce the carbon footprint? Is it something that is coming up as a topic?
I would say I certainly hope so, because from an academic lens, we're all about scenarios, we're all about uncertainty, we're all about, okay, well, what if this happens or what if that happens? And I think, again, it depends on the company itself, right? And why they're doing what they're doing when it comes to sustainability and climate reporting. I think, often when we think about whether it's, LCA or carbon accounting, we see it as an endpoint and we forget that interpretation and improvement analysis. And in my mind, that's the most important thing of what are the opportunities to change and grow? What do we know are the hot spots? Not to just, be embarrassed about them and say, oh, yeah, well, that's a problem. But how do we really think about how to change that and how to improve that? And also reducing risk from the future, whether that's internal risk or external risk of how markets are going to change and what's changing around us. And I think without having some sort of scenarios, thinking through sort of future, what's going to happen in the future, it's hard to really systematically think about improvement analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. We also hope that some strategies and what if questions will arise more and more often. And maybe I would like to come back, last question from my side. I would like to come back to packaging and
Sure.
maybe to see if there is some counterintuitive results in this sense. So, for example, if I go to supermarket and I forget my shopper, so what should I use, plastic bag or paper bag?
Ah,
I
yes.
think, I think a lot of people intuitively will say I should use paper bag.
Yeah, and sort of that's one of the age-old questions of life cycle assessment. And I think that's one of the things that we struggle with a lot is we want sort of the this is good and this is bad kind of, understanding. And unfortunately, the environment doesn't give us that, right? And so when we talk about environmental impacts of a paper bag versus environmental impacts of a plastic bag, and actually also the environmental impacts of the shopper that's reusable, there's a lot of trade-offs there. And so, one of the things our group has done is really think through, okay, how many times do you actually have to reuse a bag or reuse anything reusable before it actually is better? Because I do think there's sort of this sort of changing tide where reusable is always better. I'll get this reusable product, I'll use it 4 times, and then I'll get a new reusable product. And you're like, oh, no, no, no. You have to reuse that shopper many, many times in order for it to be the better thing. And again, that's, I think, part of the unintuitive piece of, well, just because it's reusable, that doesn't mean it's automatically better. You actually have to reuse it. And that's, I think, one of the things that people don't always really think through. In terms of the single-use products, there's often trade-offs there, right? So I think when we talk particularly about thin film plastics, they've gotten a lot of backlash, and rightfully so, for the various environmental impacts at the disposal phase. But again, when you look further up in the supply chain, there's various trade-offs when you start talking about reuse or plastic, single-use plastic, and something like a single-use paper. Because single-use paper, it does have plenty of environmental impacts that single-use plastic doesn't have, particularly in terms of water quality and the associated impacts of the pulping and paper process is not exactly a clean process. And so you often have sort of this ecological damage of improperly disposed plastic bags highlighted against sort of an upstream water quality impact. And it's not necessarily as easy as yes, no. It's kind of more of a contextual, all right, are you in a place where plastics are properly disposed of, that there's very low probability that it will actually end up in an ecosystem and cause ecosystem damage? So I would say, in terms of thin film plastic bags, my answer would be very different if I live in a coastal community with, and or that has a poor municipal solid waste infrastructure, than if I live in sort of a more landlocked region that has really good collection infrastructure. I think it would change depending on where I live.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I reuse all my shoppers.
Good on you, as do I. Some of them are getting pretty ragged around the edges. So
Absolutely, thank you. And maybe, yeah, the last, or do we have time or?
Everything we can have 2 more questions.
Yeah. I just saw also in one of your interviews you were referring to mindful consumption. Could you give us just a rough idea? What is it?
yeah, so this is, talking through mindful consumption really is kind of where I've been putting my LCA might lately, because one thing I've noticed is we tend in the community to do life cycle assessment on products that make only a marginal difference in overall environmental impact. And so we say things like, oh, is it better to have sustainable cotton jeans versus your traditional jeans? We never ask, do you need another pair of jeans? Right? And so mindful consumption really is trying to be a lot more thoughtful about what are the products that we're buying? Not just, railing against companies and saying, you need to put the product that I'm going to consume as much as I want in a better package, but how do we actually really think through, do we need what's in that package itself? Because what's in the package tends to have much greater environmental impact than the package. And so it really is being thoughtful about the kinds of things we buy and really taking a step back, particularly in the US. This is, a major issue of just sort of rampant consumption. And so kind of taking a step back of, do I need this? Does it bring me joy? Kinds of questions as we're buying stuff. And really trying to reorient our mindsets and our lifestyles beyond just the things, and trying to only buy what we need and the things that really bring us joy as humans.
Great, thank you.
So that's key. I mean, users don't need to do a lot of LCA studies to compare different products. They just need to care about their consumption.
Yes, it's one of those things where I say I can always give you this one for free. If you consume less, you're going to reduce your environmental impact. It's one of the easiest LCAs you can do, right? And so and that's a hard message, right? That's a hard message for people to think about, because it's much easier to say, all right, well, I just want to buy this product versus that product, so I'm an environmentalist, right? And so therefore I've reduced my environmental impact, and you have. And if you need that product anyway, then yes, that's great. But thinking through, all right, what do we really, really need?
Yeah. Yeah, I came recently across this term, 1.5 degrees lifestyle. I think it's something also related to that.
That's a great, I haven't heard that, but that's a great term.
Yeah.
Cool. And so I have one last question from our side, and it's more general question. So what do you think about the application of an open emission factor database similar to the one that we are developing at Climatic from an academic point of view? I mean, how academia can contribute to such a database, and also how our database can actually be useful for your projects. And I know that you do a lot of industry related projects. And also, as Anastasia mentioned, we are trying to somehow work close with the academia. So actually, what are the promising research directions, and how can academia and industry work together to close the current gaps?
No. And so it's a great question, and sort of goes to something I'd mentioned earlier, where it's really, really difficult to find credible information online. And so there are various tools that are open source that you can kind of figure out emission factors and cobble them together. But again, if you don't actually have a team that does this regularly, it's really difficult to find the data. And so I think, there is a real need and a real desire to get easily accessible, easily searchable emission factors for various kinds of things. That, of course, comes with a caution, though, in the sense that if you're just talking about, oh, I need a emission factor for a couple of things that I'm making a quick and easy comparison on, that can be helpful. But it does go back to this, is any analysis framed in sort of this systematic thinking that's really taking into account various changes, right? And so, the actual, math behind LCA and greenhouse gas accounting is pretty simple, right? It's all just pretty much basic calculations. But just as I would want to hire an accountant to do sort of any sort of financial accounting on a complicated basis, I think it's really important to not DIY, do it yourself, carbon accounting in sort of any sort of complicated terms and complicated systems. And so I think having open data is really, really essential and really important. And thinking through how to help people use that data in a way that actually is useful and is appropriate, because I do think there are some cautions there in terms of things that an LCA practitioner or someone who's been in the sustainability space would think about, that someone just going online searching for emissions factors might not necessarily immediately understand.
Okay. So there's one comment from Gustav. Is there any link to that meal pack study anywhere? Sounds super interesting.
I don't have it immediately. It was published in Resources Conservation and Recycling, but if you do a search for it, there should be a number of media hits because a number of media outlets covered the study. But certainly you can contact me directly, Shelie Miller, School for Environment and Sustainability, and I'm happy to provide the actual study and link.
Great. Thank you so much, Shelie.
Thank you a lot. Yes, very, very nice conversation.
No, thank you both so much. This was a pleasure to be here.
Yes.
Thank you, Shelie. Have a good day.
Yes, have a good day, indeed. Bye-bye. See you soon.